Good afternoon and a very, very warm welcome to you all. It's nice to see so many staff, students and visiting guests as well at this the second of our research seminars for this year. My name is Murray Gregg. I am Head of School of Wind and Percussion and Director of Brass, a chair that our speaker today has held both of those positions during his time here. John's not only a great colleague of mine, but more importantly to me, an absolutely fantastic friend. It's nice to see so many students here to listen, including those from the trombone department. John's promised to speak slowly for you, don't worry. We all know John's going to speak about his research into the history and development of the brass ensemble during the 20th century. I can't think of anyone better qualified to do so, having played most of it himself and actually been there for most of the 20th century. I've got more, don't we? As you all know, John's had a most illustrious career. First as a student at Cambridge, being deported to America, selected to go and study in America with Bill Vacchiano and Vince Chikowitz. And then on his return to the UK, spent many years playing with the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, the Philharmonia Orchestra, then the Wallace Collection. I first met John when he was a visiting tutor here when I was a student in probably 1987, I would hazard a guess at. And he was a very generous teacher to me for that time. I was a very grateful recipient of picking up the scraps of the gigs that he didn't want at that time. And since he came back as director of brass in the late 90s and then became head of school just after that, he's been an absolutely tremendous friend and colleague. So I hope you all enjoyed John's presentation today on the history and development of the brass ensemble during the 20th century.
Thank you, Murray. And I got off very lightly there, you know. But friends, you know, and friends online, it's a privilege to be here speaking to you this afternoon about my book, which has finally appeared. And I'll talk about the book. I'll maybe talk a little bit about writing a book, and I'll talk certainly about music making. And there'll be some music occurring about 5 o'clock to spice things up. Anyway, I'll just get going, you know. Now, look, the genesis of this whole thing here was my first experience of speaking in an academic circle. I was persuaded to go to New York in 2014 by Richard Wistreich. At that time, he was the director of research here. And I went and gave my talk to the Historic Brass Society. Now, look, unknown to me, in my audience, there was a chap who asked some very incredible questions that sort of really made me think. Now, this character was Gunter Schuler. Now, Gunter Schuler was one of the most influential brass players of the 20th century, and I got along very well with them, you know. So it started things going for me. Now, 3 years later, I spoke at the next conference in 2017, and I'd made quite some significant progress towards writing a journal article for the Historic Brass Society, and that journal was about the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble. Now, I had a great advantage because of the amount of information in this college, and really taking it a stage further, it was a natural thing for me to do because I'd overseen the setting up of the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble archive here in 2002. Jones died in 2000, and he wanted his materials to come to this college. And in 2017, I was retiring from my former job as running the School of Wind, Brass and Percussion. So it all really just it fitted in. Now, I'm grateful to Barbara Kelly, and I'm grateful to John Wallace, a long-standing colleague, for prompting me to tackle such a task. Now, here's the timeline. Here's what happened. I sort of put a proposal to the Boydell Press in October 2018. I had no idea that you had to do such things to get a book going, you know, and the reviews came back in December with a green light, and some actually with some very interesting suggestions and improvements, you know. So at that point, my research was all done up until about 1986, but after 1986, complete mystery, because there was almost nothing in print whatsoever regarding the modern brass ensemble. So really my research was conducted through personal contacts who were important figures in this area of activity, and information in liner notes and records. These provided all my starting points. It was as simple as that. Now, on March the 23rd, 2020, that's when the COVID lockdown occurred. Now, that brought about the sabbatical I never managed to have from the RNCM, you know. So that was it, you know, March the 23rd in 2020, and my submission date was agreed to be October 2021. So I had 1.5 years for the write-up. Now, in that period, I contacted so many librarians and archivists all over the world. For example, Yale University, the archives of the Champs-Élysées Theatre in Paris, and got quite a lot of important documents and images from them, you know. So there were a lot of people who were very helpful. Now, to a certain extent, I had some first-hand knowledge through being a member of the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, the Equali Brass, and the Wallace Collection. But I needed a lot of guidance and advice on how to get things going, because I hadn't really written anything very much, ever, really. So I'm very indebted to Martin Harlow, who got things going. You know, he started to provoke me to ask the right questions as only he could, you know. He sort of, I would come up with an idea, and then he'd bonk me on the head, and then I'd come up for air again, and how about this one, Martin, you know. But that sort of started it. I got some valuable advice from Trevor Herbert and Arnold Myers, two authorities in the history of brass, really on structure, on content. I really wanted the book to be targeted at general readers, as well as brass band students and brass enthusiasts. Now, I benefited from the extensive and ordered information here, but other focuses were much less documented. Now, many fine players, they're much more interested in playing than they are in keeping records, essentially. So consequently, there were many players and scholars who provided important information on matters of which I had sketchy knowledge. For example, Fine Arts Brass Ensemble, London Brass, the American Brass Ensemble, the LSO Brass, the RNCM in the 1990s. So really that was my methodology, was personal testimonies and working from there. Now, Sarah in the library and also Anna have both given me invaluable help in the college, and Heather Roberts provided me with valuable support just whenever I needed it. Research papers, printed books, copy of archival documents, and I'm very grateful to the RNCM Research Department for its prolonged support throughout this project. Outside the RNCM, Sandy Coffin, who is a trumpet-playing research student at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, she was painstaking in her help towards preparing manuscripts for publication and reassuring through her knowledge of this subject. You know, at home, the dedicatee of this book, June Wilkinson, supported years of continuous activity towards the publication. So she was incredibly supportive. You know, me sitting, you know, day by day, non-stop. Now, the book here, it's the first to deal with an aspect of 20th century music that's not covered in detail anywhere else yet. Now, the study ultimately focuses on developments in Britain in the second half of the 20th century, but it refers extensively to other periods and loci where events caused interactions, influence, and change. And here is the structure that emerged. Now, you can probably see here, it's in 7 chapters. I've also written the 8th chapter as well. You'll hear about that later on, because there was something I couldn't cover. But these 7 chapters chronicle key events moments in the story when change outweighed continuity. For example, the advent of complete families of brass instruments in the 19th century, the impact of Elgar Howarth's, in chapter 5, transcription of Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition. Later on, the rise of historically informed performance in the 1990s. Throughout the book, there are significant works like Janicek's Capriccio, Malcolm Arnold's Brass Quintet No. 1, or Rautavaara's Playground for Angels that are considered in depth. Now, these explain and illustrate wider trends, and they scrutinize the composer's perspective in writing for brass. Now, the end point of the book, really, it was a musical tribute to Philip Jones, who died in 2000, that was given to the Barbican Hall on 17th of January 2001. Now, to many, that event symbolised the acknowledgement of half a century of development. Now here, the next one, here's the original title. I think it's the real title. But it's one of these things is sometimes that you have to make compromises with the publishers, and the publishers just thought that title, Art Music for Brass in Britain's Part, they thought that was a little bit too fussy. So that title changed, but not very much else did, I have to say, so I did very well. So look, what's currently perceived as a brass ensemble in Britain and beyond, it barely existed in the first half of the 20th century. Now, the Antecedents in Paris and the mid-19th century and St. Petersburg at the turn of the 20th century were largely unknown in Britain. Following World War II, the World Brass Quintet and other orchestral groups emerged in the United States and in Europe. Now, the practices and repertoires associated with these modern groups came from professional players playing orchestral instruments. Now, these ensembles, they exist in many forms, from small chamber groups like Pulong's Trio, written in 1922, to symphonic brass sections with percussion and conductor. A good example is Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. Now, the similarity in appearance between that, between the Copland's Fanfare and the British-style brass band belies quite radical differences in instrumentation, performance practice, and repertoire. You see, for example, brass bands, they generally adhere to models that include doubled parts, like the strings in a symphony orchestra. In most brass ensembles, the music is played one player for each part. Now here is the British brass band. It's very important because the British brass band is a big part of RNCM life. It's a pretty brilliant conception, and it was established in about 1870. Everything fits together. Everything fits together beautifully. The instruments are all similar. Most of them have conical bores. They just merge, as you will hear a little bit later. The flugelhorn has a bit of a solo role. The very Germanic euphonium has a solo role as well. Now, this hasn't changed very much. The book, it touches on this brass band culture throughout. I think it's such an important part of British amateur culture. And it has many advocates and experts in this building. And I'll return to this, as I've said, I'll return to this later. But look, let's just first of all look briefly at some of the antecedents in the 19th century. They're a very important part of my narrative. Now, some of these antecedents have really been uncovered by British researchers recently in the last 30 years. Now, specifically, and I'm going to read here, the social and economic changes of the 19th century led to an unprecedented development of a wider musical public in the Western world, a cultural democratization that was a factor of significant changes in musical tastes and idioms. Now, this development and comparable technological and manufacturing advances produced a series of watersheds in the design, the production and the distribution of brass instruments. In the mid-century, Europe, also the ascendancy of the military band as a primary symbol of state and the phenomenon of the working class amateur brought brass instruments unprecedented popularity. Now, in this time of change, inventors and manufacturers, pioneer players, composers, and the wider public interacted. So really, in this context, the beginnings of evolution of types of chromatic brass instruments occurred and happened in fits and starts, you know. The emergence of both professional and amateur idioms at this time includes the amateur British brass band. Now I'm going to focus on a specific brass quintet that sprung up in Paris around 1850. And this type of brass quintet, it endeavoured to elevate brass playing into the realm of chamber music. And here it is. It's chromatic brass music by Pulong. Now, Pulong, he was a concertmeister, conductor, composer. He was a friend of Berlioz, and he wrote 12 substantial works for a mix of keyed brass, that's the ophicleide, slide techniques, that's the trombone, and newer valved instruments. Now, Pulong's music, it was performed in a society set up. It was a society Calcio Philharmonique. That's loosely translated. That's a society for the appreciation of brass music. And there he was known amongst his friends as the Haydn of brass. But enough to say that 1850, it was a point of convergence of technology, pioneer players, interested composers and players. It was at the vanguard of development, and shown not least in Berlioz's orchestra, you know. Now, the valved instruments, they soon became dominant, partly through the endeavours of Adolphe Sax. Now, Sax's instruments were used by the French military at the point when they were becoming so important. But Pulong's distinctive body of work became lost and forgotten until some of the music was uncovered in the British Library about 1995 by a friend of mine, Anthony George, who plays the ophicleide. So he went rummaging for ophicleide material, and they chanced upon these works, you know, which is pretty incredible because I got to play them and record them, you know, as well. You know, it's a fascinating world, you know. But chromatic valve brass with sets of valve with everybody with the same valve, it spread like wildfire. And I can see why, you know, you're using 3 digits of the right hand, and all the instruments have a similar sort of pattern for the fingering, you know, and it just fits together. And I'm going to move on to another very, very short case study. It's from the end of the 19th century. These things, they sprung up all over the place almost simultaneously, and sometimes not very connected. So here are the quintets by Victor Ewald. Now, there was only one of the quintets of Victor Ewald known until about the 1970s. Another 2 works that were discovered and circulated. But this piece is a quintet in B flat minor. It's sort of I would say it's a real work of chamber music. It's Victor Ewald, he played the cello in a string quartet that played in soirees of a timber merchant. Now, the soirees had attendees of Tchaikovsky, Borodin, and many others. It was a real melting pot. Now, there's no evidence that the brass quintets were played at these soirees, but I mean, I think when the timber merchant, when he died, Ewald sort of he decided to, I think gave up the cello and took up the tuba. But he was an amateur musician, and he was a very distinguished civil engineer. There were many societies at this time, you know, and I think the Russian culture is an interesting one, because even the Tsar played the cornet. He had a courtois cornet, you know. So, you know, so in addition to this evolution for writing for brass in the orchestra, is evidence in Rimsky-Korsakov Scheherazade and the Pathétique Symphony, which is about the same time as this. There's a small distinctive repertoire of late Romantic chamber music. Now, really, it's not really part of a global trend. You know, the events in Paris and in Russia and the Baltic and other places, they were really local. They were local phenomena in which music societies had important roles. But I would say that the Parisian one, the Société Calcio-Philharmonique, and the St. Petersburg Society of Wind Music Lovers, and others were focal points where aspirations could be raised. Similarly, the Wiener Waldhornverein was founded in 1883, and the membership of professional, student and amateur horn players included a guy called Johannes Brahms. Now, you know, so what I would say was that these pioneers' dreams of brass chamber music would be realized in the succeeding century. Now, there's something very interesting about this piece by Ewald. Most brass players, they consider that this is orchestral music, but it was actually written for brass band type instruments. It's for sax horns, a valve, baritone, and 2 cornets. So it's not orchestral music at all. But funnily enough, the trombone players, they never bat an eyelid. You know, the trombone players, they like getting around all the semiquavers. It's really fantastic. It doesn't matter, you know. It just doesn't matter. Now, one last glimpse at the 19th century, and it's a funny one. This. I just found this one early example of the music of Giovanni Gabrielli, and it was the earliest publication of a transcription for brass that I ever found. You know, the 1878 was the first substantial collection of early music in Leipzig. 1885, we know that the first performance of Gabrieli's Sonata Pianoforte in modern times took place in Leipzig. Now, this little aspect of what we might call brass playing, although this music it wasn't originally written for brass instruments as we know it, that had a bit of a flickering at the end of the 19th century, and it really re-emerged in the 1930s. Now, moving on into the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century is an extraordinary time for brass, really, because it was like a melting pot. And, you know, the United States, it was a decisive force in 2 world wars. The United States became a world leader in matters of power, economy, and cultural influence. But in addition to the advent and escalation of jazz, brass players' connections with art music were significantly influenced by American practices, really, all around the world. But more explicitly, this brass music making, it developed in numerous interwoven national cultures and situations. And I've got about 3 or 4 points to make about this. One was that a rapid integration of ragtime, then jazz, was incorporated into art music by Stravinsky and his contemporaries, and it led to the trumpet, the cornet and trombone coming to the fore. Think of the Milhaud's ballet La Création du Monde, Walton's Facade, Kurt Weill's The Threepenny Opera. They reflect nuanced application of jazz techniques. In the widest sense, you see, the music and instrumentation of jazz and the big band was transformative. Brass instruments became ubiquitous. You know, they weren't popular before the 19th century. They became ubiquitous, epitomized by Louis Armstrong. More is said about this in the book, about the advent of jazz. I've been quite detailed about this. Now, secondly, at the end of the 19th century, many of the leading composer-conductors gave virtuosity a last twist. Gustav Mahler, you know, etc. Schoenberg, Webern, who came later, but there was music for self-standing brass from this period, and really the little pieces that dot up here and there, they reflect the expectations of prominent composers more than they indicate radical changes in musical taste. Some of the examples are Strauss's Feierlicher Einzug in 1919, passages from Debussy's Le Martyr de Saint Sebastian in 1911, and Paul Dukas' little fanfare Pour précéder La Péri in 1912, which opened his Poème dansé in the Theatre of the Châtelet. after World War I, the French interest in orchestral brass continued in music by Schmidt and Albert Roussel. So there was point number 3. Contrary to the popularity of the British brass band, it was everywhere in written by the 20th century, and the international fame of the Sousa band, small formations of orchestral brass players performing art music had little identity and critical mass around the world. This didn't change until after the Second World War. So, for example, Ives from the Steeples in the Mountains, 1905 to 1906, that was an innovative and unprecedented. It lay unperformed until 1953, when it was taken up by Leonard Bernstein and members of the New York Philharmonic. Nonetheless, from the 1920s, post-war euphoria, composers, perceptions of brass, experimentation, doubtless other factors led to intermittent but significant works for small all-brass combinations. Some of these were originally heard in cosmopolitan contemporary music circles and societies, and I've just chosen one example to show you today. Many of you can see, just down at the very bottom left-hand corner, a little sonata by Francis Pulong. And it identifies the 3 players, and I'd always wondered who these players were and where they played that piece. But there it is. So it came early in his career, when he was a student of Kirchlin and a member of Les Six. And you can see it was premiered in 1923. Now, there are numerous other brass band, what we would call landmark pieces. Villa-Lobos's Chorus Number 4 for 3 horns and trombone, for example, written in Rio de Janeiro and yet again performed in Paris. Carol Ruggles' Angels for 6 muted trumpets, 1920-21. It was given in 1922 at the International Composers Guild in New York, co-founded by Varese, and then twice in 1925 in Los Angeles and Venice. Now, Janáček, he was present at the concert in Venice and for his own quartet, and he wrote that in the theatre Fenice, the audience laughed and whistled at the angel trumpets. So poor old Ruggles, he got the bird from his audience. Now, despite this, Angels was republished in 1925 and revised, including trombones, in 1938. So really, finally, in this era, in parallel with these things, progressive mixed chamber music highlighted a more important evolution. Brass chamber music, it wasn't really that important, but there were bigger things. For example, Stravinsky's Octet, 1923, it shows a parity between the functions of brass and woodwind counterparts in respect of agility and nuanced timbre. This is comparable with Varese's Octandre and in other works in the Second Viennese School. Now, in this respect, one little piece by Janáček, his Capriccio, is remarkable. It's a late chamber music for piano left hand, for flute, piccolo, 2 trumpets, 3 trombones, and tenor tubas. It's an extraordinary work. It's a late, mature work of some significance, and I examine this in some detail in the book. So I examine a lot of the antecedents that spring up here and there, and really I talk about the development of brass playing through jazz and then further forwards. Now, onwards to familiar territory. Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, which I sort of played in from 1972. It was a little bit later than this, but here is Jones's first concert. Now, he'd run his brass ensemble for about 10 years before this happened. Now, he always said that it was very, very hard to get anything happening with brass ensembles in Britain. Nobody was interested. And you'll see that his first concert at the Aldeburgh Festival, it was on a barge. And it says on the mere, on a barge, if wet, in the Workman's Club. But he made a good impression and they were invited back the next year. And his group, it really grew and it really developed. But he struggled, you know. It wasn't all given to him on a plate by any means, and that was his big achievement. Was really sort of achieving. I suppose he always called it respectability, and but that was his term, not mine. But he struggled to get his group to sort of taken seriously. He was very influenced, as I've said earlier. He was influenced by things American. Now, what he did with me, he used to, Philip Jones, he had a nickname for me. He used to call me Jokalajevich. That was my name. He said, Jokalajevich, dear boy, I'm going to send you to the United States. And that's what he did. He sent me off to the United States to find out about the way they played the trumpet in the United States. So that was his impetus, you know, in continuing my study, you know. So here is what really influenced the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, and I found this in a very, very small advert in the Times. It was a really tiny thing, but I managed to find out what they actually came and played. Now, that is quite a tough program, you know. The previous program, that's not a tough program, but the Americans, they had slightly different concepts of what was achievable on the brass instruments, and it's maybe something to do with the proximity of the jazz idiom in New York. So that was a big impetus, particularly the tuba player. You know, the tuba player who was all over the place with a phenomenal technique. And that was mirrored a little bit later in '66, when there was a tuba player called John Fletcher from Leeds, who joined the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble. But before that, the tuba was comparatively undeveloped. And the New York phenomenon, it's actually quite interesting. It all developed, you know, just at the end of the Second World War. In the Second World War, after the servicemen returned home, they were the beneficiaries, something called the GI Bill. It was re-establishing them in society, and they could all go to university and train. And the music colleges, the Juilliard, it became oversubscribed, so there was no room for anybody to play in the orchestras. So the players, they formed their own brass ensemble called the New York Brass Ensemble. It was a fantastic example of student-led development. You know, it really was. You know, they were amazing. And they made gramophone records and all sorts of things. They were go-getters. Now, another participant at this time was Gunter Schuler, he was self-taught, and he joined the Cincinnati Orchestra in 1943. Now, he wrote a big symphony in 1950. It's quite frequently played today, and it was radical in its conception. 12-tone, no compromises. Schuler, he sought to avoid all the cliches of writing for brass instruments. For example, writing for the French horn, as we would expect the romantic French horn to sound, and so on. He wanted it all to be a lot more tougher than that, tougher and with 100 different degrees, you know. But Schuler, he established another society. I think it's the Jazz and Classical Brass Society of New York, and they made a rather wonderful record in 1957. So you have all these crack players, young players, new generation, soloist, Miles Davis. Other soloist on the trombone, J.J. Johnson. It's a fantastic thing, you know, fantastic record, and you can still get it. Now, in Britain, this Philip Jones thing, it really took hold, and groups grew up and spread, and there were a number of them by the late 60s. Here are some of them: the London Gabrieli Brass Ensemble. I can think of other titles: the Lock Brass Concert, the Halley Brass Concert. Now, these names, if you think of these names, the ooze, again, status and respectability. You know, so that's what they sought to do. You know, they thought, we're going to associate ourselves with the music of Gabrieli. It's very posh. You know, the venues in which it is played. You know, at very, very high occasions. You know, now a further thing happened around this time. I mean, it's an increasingly globalized audience for classical music evolved in the final decades of the 20th century. And this was triggered to quite a considerable extent by the record industry. Gramophone records replaced the impact of radio broadcasts. In my study of evolving records, and the liner notes provided information. In addition, the overlapping interests of the players, composers and publishers led to the emergence of specialist brass music publishing. Now, the first one was in the United States, the Robert King catalogue. You'll probably see examples in the library with Robert King, established in 1940. BIM in Switzerland was set up in 1970. Just Brass, that was run by Philip Jones and Gary Howarth, 1975. Now, from these things, I compiled a selective list of published music and a selective discography. That, you know, and these things are not comprehensive, but they're non-existing. So these are the first ones. So they're pretty useful sources of knowledge. You know, they might be a good, valuable resource for you to look for repertoire. You know, the brass quintets, they were very competitive. I'll show you the next one. Very Mancunian. So here it is, the Halle Brass Concert. Now that's a cracker of that's actually a cracker of a record, you know, made in 1968. And there's always been a little bit of, I would say, healthy competition between North and South. There was always an unwavering banter between the tuba players. The tuba player in Manchester was Stuart Roebuck. Murray would remember him, you know. Real character, fantastic player, and John Fletcher in the south, you know. So the Roebuck, he called himself the King of the North, and Fletcher was King of the South. But the ironic thing about this was that in the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, most of his players were from the north of England. You know, Alfred James was from Carlisle, John Iveson was from Cumbria, Fletcher was from Leeds, you know. So it was a funny one, but you get this competitiveness. Now this record, and it's well worth a listen. It was audacious because the Halle Brass concert, they pinched all the premiere recordings, because the Malcolm Arnold Brass Quintet that was commissioned and played by the New Yorkers in 1961. It was written for the New York Brass Quintet, not for Britain. Gregson's Quintet for Brass. It was rewritten for the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble. Horvitz's Music Hall Suite likewise. The exception is John McCabe Rounds for Brass Quintet. I would recommend that work. You know, it's a goodie. You know, it's a goodie. So very, very competitive. You know, and by this stage, there was quite I would say by 1970, there was quite a substantial repertoire of brass music to choose from, and I'll just spell it out a little bit. One is transcription of music of the 16th and 17th centuries, including Viennese music, English and German mixed concert music. So you get all sorts of things. Matthew Locke, arranged by Anthony Baines. That's way back in the 1950s. Musica Rara, published as a lot of things in the 1960s, and it was published for a very eager market of brass players who wanted stuff to play. Now this, the performance of this, it really had quite a following in the 1930s, and it lasted up and beyond the early music revival in the 70s. Now secondly, romantic music for small groups of chromatic brass. That's from about 1815 to 1915. That's become more popular recently as scholarship has developed. Original music for brass ensembles from 1920. Now, I've described some of that to you, you know, the Ruggles Angels and all the little pieces here and there, but it built up. Now, the 1970s in Britain, it was a prime period of real development. Put it this way, in 1968, the London Sinfonietta was founded. Boulez conducted the BBC Symphony Orchestra from 1971 to 1975. Now, the Contemporary Music Network of the Arts Council was set up in 1971. The Ensemble Intercontemporain in Paris, 1972. These organisations, they bred players with progressive ideas. really. Now, the last thing that I touched on was really the last thing that I will touch on now was arrangements and transcriptions for brass. Now, many of these that were created by players for the groups they played in, and they really, for me, the merited exploration of their aesthetic dimensions and what they meant for the contemporaries. Now, none of these is more prominent than Howarth's orchestration of pictures at an exhibition. So that was a big event in brass in the UK in the 20th century. And here's a little view into it. So that we discovered in the archives. There's a sketchbook, and if you look very, very closely at that, you can decipher a lot of detail. Muted euphoniums, choke cymbals, all sorts of very, very refined ideas. Now, this piece, it was first performed in the recording studio, so that's not unusual, you know. It was recorded October '77. It was premiered the next year in the Queen Elizabeth Hall in 1978. There was a big BBC prom August 1979. That was a peak point of this type of music. Now, it wasn't the only innovative and radical brass event. Brass music in the mid-70s, it had quite an exposure. Grimethorpe Aria was performed by Grimethorpe Colliery Band in the proms in 1974 by Harry Birtwistle. Hens's Ragtimes and Habaneras was performed at the proms in 1975. These predated the pictures. The Loch Brass Concert, they made an excellent recording of the complete music of Richard Strauss in 1979. So these are all prestigious events that were actually taken very seriously. Now, in addition to these developments, you know, of contemporary music and big transcriptions, there were other sort of things. There were other things really just cooking up. Notions of instrumental and choral colours were championed by leading members of the early music revival. That's Elliott Carter and Roger Norrington. Now, all of this is spread eventually to other eras of music and other types of music making. Now, His Majesty's Sackbuts and Cornets was established in 1982. Later research discovered 19th century brass repertoire, including the brass band, and early 20th century brass chamber music, of which the history and influence is less familiar. And here is it's kind of a reconstruction of the Cyfarthfa band in Wales, with some of my chums there, all playing on period instruments. You probably don't see it very clearly, but there's ophicleides, a keyed bugle, and the instruments are all old. You know, now that was a very big research project. So there we have really quite sort of interesting research getting into the brass area. That was a fantastic project, you know. Now, in parallel with these advances in scholarship, enhancements in higher education and in youth organisations mirrored a broader recognition of art music for brass. The Guildhall School established a hybrid ensemble in 1971 that performed music for orchestral combinations and for brass band, just like we do here now, you know. The University of Salford was the first British institution of higher education to ratify a full-time course in band musicianship, but others followed with a variety of courses. In 1980, Fine Arts Brass Ensemble had its origins in the Birmingham School of Music and Birmingham University. In 1992, Onyx Brass was formed by ex-members of the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain. The ECYO, the European Community Youth Orchestra, Murray, I think you were in that from its inception. Not quite. And later, the European Union Youth Orchestra, it really broke down national boundaries, and it raised the expectations of young orchestral players who formed multinational ensembles. Now, the emergence of the female brass player in Britain, it is and is a very important development in brass playing. Now, in the 80s, Susan Addison and trumpeter Anne McEnany, they were part of newly founded groups. The establishment of an all-female trombone quartet in a British conservatoire in 1999. That was here. It was no longer very unusual, but there were earlier ones. The earliest I could trace was the Galena Brass Quintet in the mid-1970s. They were graduates of the Royal Academy of Music and the Guildhall School, but they played in the Purcell Room in 1979 and played Justin Connolly Sankapas and all sorts of contemporary music of that time. And they were really the first of their kind. Now, the RNCM, has been a rather interesting institution. Now, the RNCM, it sort of applies some wide-ranging changes. Now, this was the first conservatoire. It was the first conservatoire in Britain to admit brass band students on the full degree program, and it was a fantastic development, because people who played the cornet and the euphonium could come from Switzerland, Norway, and other countries where they didn't have courses for their particular instruments, and that made the RNCM quite a focus here. And I think there were other wider range changes, which I'm going to read you a little paragraph here. The last decades of the 20th century included periods of self-analysis for Britain's musical training, with the ensuing prospects for emerging musicians. The establishment of Live Music Now by Menuhin and Ian Stoutsker in 1977 provided new opportunities for the public to hear music in schools, care homes, hospitals and other settings, enabling many individuals to hear live music for the first time. Solo musicians or groups up to 5 could audition and be mentored into 2 years paid engagements, often a step towards further professional work. Now, likewise, the annual music competition of the Royal Overseas League and concerts of the Park Lane Group Musical Trust increasingly identified and publicised emerging groups. In addition, Peter Renshaw, head of development at the Guildhall School, challenged the methodology of music education and researched processes of managing musical creativity, collaboration and leadership. Now, these factors undoubtedly stimulated brass chamber music and its reception in various forms. And this program here is the program from an event at the St. Petersburg Conservatoire in 2002. Now, Tubalati was a group of 2 euphoniums and 2 tubas, founded in 1991, and they sort of really they sort of created very individual and out of the ordinary original works. And really, they come from here, as a region of Britain where amateur brass playing is ubiquitous, and also where there's an enthusiasm for technical brilliance. But its influence was developed in part by creative workshops for players and composers. And this is typical. Now, the instrumentation of brass groups has become less important than what they're doing in society, So brass music got on a different footing, really altogether. So really, brass playing in the end of the 20th century, it changed phenomenally. Now, after Philip Jones, there was a huge succession of groups that filled the gap when he stopped in 1986. The groups that really got formed were London Brass, were formed in 1986. London Brass they excelled in, orthodox brass playing, but they developed into a fully crossover group playing jazz by by the start of the 20th century, and they've done some wonderful things. So they're multi-talented and unbelievably versatile. The group that I've been involved in, the Wallace Collection, it did other things. It sort of branched off on its own, and it created themed concerts, really round about, you know, I mean, for example, round about, you know, for example, the French Revolution. When it was the bicentenary of the French Revolution, a program was put together. It was invented. When we don't have the repertoire, we invent it, you know, and so on. So there's been a broadening of groups, and I think that those groups, you know, they're very different from one another, but they benefit from I think a mutual interchange between themselves. You know, there's such a wide range. Now all of this, it was inconceivable in 1951. Now I think we should move on, and I think we should hear some music. So welcome Rosamond Brass. Now what I've done is I've talked a little bit more than I anticipated. You know, I mean, I don't know what so much to say about it, but my book, which is emerged, my book is written in 7 consecutive chapters. Now there was one aspect of brass playing written that I didn't include, and that was the music of the amateur brass bands. And then that was really a rather parallel thing. Now the brass band music of the type that you're going to hear, it existed mainly in brass band contests until much later. But I mean, I want you to have a little listen to this little selection from it's Preciosa, isn't it, by William. Here, we'll skip that one. So here's a little section, a selection of from Weber's Preciosa. Now I just want to, I want you to hear 2 or 3 or 4 snippets from various parts of the piece, so you get some idea about brass band contesting. So here's a little bit from the bolero at the start. It's an absolute gift. You know, the arranger of this was William Rimmer. William Rimmer, he was from Southport, you know, and he was a dominant and fantastic figure in the brass band world. And he was a virtuoso cornet player, and then he became a very accomplished arranger and publisher. You know, and his publishing company was in Liverpool. Now that's fantastic for brass, because we can demonstrate triple tonguing, and we can demonstrate our fingers. Now, just listen to this second little, it's an extract from a larghetto. Sometimes say that the long 19th century continued till about 2022. But you know, you can hear that, and you can hear why brass players are so fond of this type of music. Now, William Rimmer, he couldn't resist putting in a couple of little tests for the players. So there were a couple of little cadenzas. Alex, can you just play us a bar or two? There we are. You see, in brass band contests, you need to test the soloistic abilities of the players. We used to call them the corner men, and there's that with the euphonium and the cornet really respectively. So that's another element that's tested in the contests. Now, Rimmer, he was very astute. He always wanted the ensembles to sound good. So we'll just play you the last few bars of it, and you'll notice how the tessitura is not too high. He kind of writes in the middle, so the instruments sound in the best register. So thank you very much. That's so lovely. Larry, would it be okay if we just heard this piece? So we'll hear this piece. It lasts 8 minutes, and after the 8 minutes, I'll wrap up in about 1 minute. Say everything that I want to say. We'll just hear Preciosa as selected and arranged for brass quartet. So here is the British Brass Band Quartet, which is still very lively organisation. So I think a huge thank to Rosamond Brass for playing so beautifully. Now that music it stayed very popular till about the 1960s, and in the 1960s it was probably replaced by more modern, but still quite popular music, you know, by Gilbert Vinter. And really, this world it stayed quite a contained world until recently, you know, and really recent groups like, you know, A4 Brass, they're out about in the big wider world. You know, they're very popular just because of the way they play their brass band instruments and the way they communicate with each other and the way they communicate with the audience. It means a lot, you know. So I mean, the audiences love it, and the audiences they take to their music that they invent themselves. A4 Brass is similar to this, but there's one cornet, one tenor horn, one baritone horn, and one euphonium. I remember when they came here, they proposed forming a group, and I wasn't very sure about it. I said, "Well, what are you going to play?" And they said, "Well, we're going to write our own." And about a year later, they won the Chamber Music Prize at the RNCM. It was quite astonishing, and they're still busy. But I think there's another factor to this, is that many students who come here really to study brass band instrument, they come studying an instrument and they leave as composers. Gavin Higgins, you know, Lucy Pankhurst, and you know, this is a really very interesting development for me, and this is really the essence of the chapter 8 that I've really written. You know, the chapter 8 of the book that will be delivered. There's a conference on romantic brass in Bern next April, and I'm hoping I can present that there. You know. But really, that's the world of brass, you know. And I think today, I think what I've just alighted on here and there. I mean, it's not been a thorough history, but I've just touched here and there, talking about antecedents and other ideas. You know, things seem to ignite. Things seem to take hold, and we brass players will tackle anything. We like playing contemporary music, we like inventing our own, we like challenges, we like performing. Anyway, that's the world of brass, and I'm going to leave it there. So I'm going to say thank you.
I'll come down here just so everyone online can hear me as well. John, thank you for a fantastic presentation. Not just in, you know, showing your depth of knowledge of the subject matter and this labour of love, but also actually demystifying some of the processes of writing and publishing a book, which may be of interest to some colleagues and students here. And thank you to Rosamond Brass. That was amazing, in a notoriously unforgiving acoustic as well, as we know, for those of us who've played in this room. Does anyone have any questions? And I'm here. Oh, we've got some comments online. If you can hear me, I think you can on YouTube, and you have questions, put them on the instant chat. That's why I have my phone. I'm not checking my bookie. Oh, questions, anybody?
these things, they've existed since about the 1890s. Both, I suppose the groups which have prevailed have been this type of mixed ensemble, 2 cornets, a tenor horn and a euphonium. It's a little bit like the string quartet, but trombone quartets are also very popular. They've always been popular, and the trombone quartets, they go back at least into the time of Gabrieli and Monteverdi, you know, so and Beethoven and so on, and the trombone quartets, they tend to be a little bit more coherent because the various cultures are closer together, particularly following the foundation of the International Trombone Association in the 1970s. So professional and amateur players, they talk to one another. Before then, the trombone quartets in the brass band world, they formed their own music, and it was a little bit idiosyncratic, I would say, you know. But yeah, so these types of quartets have existed for a long time. There are other quintets and septets, with a long history as well. I mean, there was quite an interesting group in the, I think it was about the 60s and 70s, called the James Shepherd Versatile Brass. Now, what they played, it was really sort of very hot, popular music, you know, and played very, very well. And they crossed over to a certain extent into the Philip Jones music, and they used a piccolo trumpet. You know, usually you don't have a piccolo trumpet in the brass band, but they used one, so they were indeed versatile. Does that answer your question, Andy?
It does indeed.
Thank you.
Michelle?
Hi, John. Thank you. Absolutely fascinating, and that was an incredible performance. Thank you. Yeah, really, 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 really interesting. I just wondered. I think possibly you've been quite modest in your presentation of the history of brass music in your role in that. You know, you clearly had a role not just with your research, but as a performer as well. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about what you feel that has been and is and will be in future. As a performer, what stamp have you put on the development of the brass ensemble?
Right. Well, this would probably relate to my own journey, my own development. I was brought up playing the type of music that you've just heard. I mean, I played in a brass band quartet when I was a kid, before I was even a teenager, and that's how we learned. Really, we were tutored in people's homes, and that would be the first place that I ever heard any Weber and a lot of things, other things as well. But really, when I was in my late teens, that was the time that Malcolm Arnold's quintet Malcolm Arnold's quintet was when I was 10. But I mean, this sort of music, it was essentially contemporary music. So when I was 15, you know, Malcolm Arnold's quintet, that was really modern to me. And of course I relished playing it because I was playing chamber music, the same of John McCabe's rounds. You know, it really excited me. And you know, when I think back on it, it doesn't sound like contemporary music then. It doesn't sound like contemporary music now, but it was then. You know, so I did all of that. And when I was about 20 or 21, I started getting involved in Philip Jones's group, and that was a privilege because I mean I was the kid. Very definitely, you know, and I was sat there, and it was easy because everybody around you played so well and played well in tune. You just had to sit down and just slot in, and that was a big thrill. And really, in that era, I played in a lot of premieres of things like the three, what is it they called, the Brass Cats. The brass players are all known by Chris Hazel. You know, Chris Hazel was Jones's producer, and I played in all of those pieces, and I played in the pictures at an exhibition in the 1970s, which was a real thrill because, and that was quite awe-inspiring because of the size of the project. It was really something that we we thought it couldn't possibly be done. How can you possibly play something like Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition on brass instruments? And the music critics, they weren't sure about it until they heard it. Of course, today, 40 years later, it's normal for student ensembles to play these things. But these were events, in a sense, that set the standards and raised the bar. You know, I've played a lot of contemporary music, Xenakis, you know, I mean, mostly everything. Elliott Carter's brass quintet. It's a real workout. Peter Maxwell Davies's brass quintet. It sort of lasts for about half an hour, unremitting playing, and you just wonder if it's possible you can manage it. But if you practice it enough, you get there. So I've played all of these pieces, and I recorded all of Maxwell Davies's music in his presence. And that was a research project in the 1990s, but the outcomes got lost, they got misplaced, and they sort of reappeared in about 2015, and they were issued in about 2015. All that music with Max. So I've done a lot of contemporary music, and it's painstaking, but you know, contemporary music, in a sense, it gave brass playing a boost, because we were playing music really on the same terms as everybody else. So that was and since then I've been quite involved in the re-performance of 19th century music. Now, we discovered a lot of it, and I even recorded quite a lot of it in the lockdown. We were able to go to St Andrews University and record all these 12 quintets spaced apart, 2 meters apart. It's difficult to play when you're all 2 meters apart, but that's what we did, and it was a wonderful thing to play with other people. So I'm still involved in really uncovering and performing 19th century music. The instruments are great to play. You know, the feel good. You know, they feel good. They behave in a slightly different manner. Modern brass instruments, they're more perfect and they're more homogeneous. But the older instruments are a little bit more quirky and a bit more individual. You know.
I do have a question from, no one will be surprised, from Jack Alder-McKee, who is an amazing tubist and a PhD researcher here, and he's been watching on YouTube. To what extent is the brass ensemble in 20th century Britain a meeting point between brass bands and orchestral brass players, both in terms of ornological developments and socio-cultural phenomena? And you know, for Jack as a tubist, I can see the significance. That's a very good question. But yeah, that's a very good question. And you know, those two worlds, they've come together. I would say periodically. You know, periodically. I think many of the most prominent brass players in the UK had origins in the brass band world. You know, you can think about people like Maurice Murphy, he's a famous example. Philip Jones Knott, Ifor James, the horn player, yes. They're rather interlinked. I think that in the 1960s, the design of instruments changed a little bit. In the 1960s, players in the UK started to play on American instruments. Probably one of the most obvious examples would be the con trombones. Now, the con trombones, they sold themselves as being able to play with an equal sort of sonority over the whole range and over a big dynamic range. Now that was a new thing. So really instruments became more international. The horn players, rather than playing on old F horns, played on modern single B flats, and they were from Germany customarily. Now that's changed probably in recent years because there are so many more sophisticated manufacturers in different countries. But it's quite a complex. That's quite a complex question. But I would say that brass bands in the 21st century, they're probably more developed. I wouldn't say more sophisticated, they're more developed, not least because of the RNCM Festival of Brass Bands that's been held here annually,
with Paul Hindmarsh. That's brought together probably the more serious brass band music, and so this is an important place in that regard, you know.
What about the impact of individuals in that respect, like Gary Harrop, who traversed orchestra and brass band and did so much? Did he bring them together as well?
He really brought them together. There's a page in this little chip of a book here, and I can't remember the page number, but there's a page when the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble and the brass band world really coincided. It really coincided because of Elgar Howarth, and because of James Watson. He was a very prominent person, and because of John Fletcher. Everybody loved John Fletcher because he was a virtuoso player, but with virtuoso abilities at communicating his music making. He felt that the big thing about music making was communication. He felt that it should be what we're saying, you know. So yes, there've been sort of amazing convergences, you know. I've played a few times. I've had the privilege of playing with Ian Bousfield in chamber music and in other things, and he's another one, brass band origin, eminent orchestral player, London Symphony Orchestra, Vienna Philharmonic, but he's just the same as all of us. He loves playing, and it doesn't really matter what he's playing in, it's how he does it. I think Murray's after me.
I was going to just try and see if we could combine Adam's question about small groups coming from within the brass band. I actually forgot to mention your membership of Equali Brass, as whilst you were a member of Equali, actually you were there for the first time. And I was out of a job around that time in all that.
Oh!
But you were actually all colleagues with the Philharmonic Orchestra.
Yes.
Who spent hours and hours and hours working together.
That's true. The Equali Brass, I mean, it emerged in about, I think it was 1977, and we just really got together. We were all in the same orchestra, and we had the idea that we could all be we could play when the orchestra wasn't busy. And we approached a lot of composers with whom we worked, and sometimes there were film music composers or contemporary composers who would write music for us. And we had a really good repertoire. We were taken up by Nimbus Records and made a number of records down in Wales. And it was a very, very happy period of my life, I must say. It was a lot of fun, and sometimes the music was a lot of fun as well. But you know, I think if you play in a brass quintet, you've all got to get on together on tour, and that's one of the things. That's one of the elements that forges real chamber music, is the personal connections.
Yeah, and we have a very simple answer for once, which the answer to the question, do you want to see Murray's photograph, is yes. Having seen it already. We're getting to that time of the evening where we take the conversation, no brass cliches intended, towards the bar. From a different era. Does anyone have any final questions before we move on? Yes,
Not a
Anna.
question, but if it's still there, the RNCM library has the original LP of the Halle Brass consort. I remember it well. You have to ask to see it because it will be downstairs.
That will have to be dug out of cold storage and brought back to the thought.
There it is, and it's a cracker. Yeah.
John, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you to Rosamund Brass. I know that your book is wider ranging than this, but I think brass, for those of us who've been here for a while, is really woven into the fabric of the RNCM and indeed the narrative of the Northwest, and it's really special to hear you talk about it. and can't wait to read it. It's nice you mentioned Lucy, because I love this.
Yeah. Well, it's, I mean, that's I think there's an interesting thing to pick up on here. And I don't think I've finished it yet, but